The sun stands at its zenith on a Tuesday afternoon, casting short, sharp shadows across the pavement of a world that believes itself to be permanent. In the mundane hum of midday traffic and the quiet clatter of office life, there is no immediate indication that the fundamental contract between the earth and the heavens has been torn asunder. For eons, the moon has been a silent sentry, a silver ghost tethered by the invisible threads of gravity, receding at a pace of a few centimetres every year. It was a relationship defined by distance and predictable cycles. But at this precise moment, the outward drift halts, shudders, and reverses. The notification of this change does not arrive as a digital chime or a frantic headline scrolling across a screen. It manifests instead as a subtle, sickening shift in the very architecture of reality. The laws of physics, which usually operate in the background of existence like an unnoticed heartbeat, suddenly scream for attention. The sky ceases to be a distant ceiling and begins its transformation into a looming tomb. High above the atmosphere, the delicate balance between centripetal force and the relentless pull of the Earth snaps. The moon does not merely fall in a straight line, it begins a terminal, spiralling descent, reclaiming the space it has spent billions of years vacating. As the first hour of this new epoch passes, the change is nearly imperceptible to the naked eye, yet the mathematics of the solar system have already written the conclusion. There are exactly 67 hours remaining before the celestial order dissolves into a chaotic graveyard of stone and fire. This is the transition from a world of predictable tides and romantic moonlight to a reality dictated by the violent geometry of a collapsing orbit. The psychological weight of this realization descends upon the global population not all at once, but in waves of mounting terror. Astronomers and orbital mechanics are the first to witness the impossible on their monitors. They see the numbers shift, the orbital velocity increasing even as the distance decreases. It is a frantic, accelerating race toward a center that cannot hold. As word spreads, the collective gaze of humanity turns upward. The moon, which for all of human history was a static ornament no larger than a thumb held at arm's length, begins to grow. It is no longer a flat disk. It is revealing its true nature as a three-dimensional titan of basalt and regolith. The familiar features, the Sea of Tranquility, the jagged rim of the Tycho crater, start to sharpen and swell, as if the moon is leaning down to whisper a secret to the world it is about to destroy. By the time the sun begins to set on this final Tuesday, the moon is already noticeably larger than it was at noon. It hangs in the twilight like a pale, unblinking eye, its silver light beginning to take on a harsh, oppressive quality. The tides, usually a rhythmic and dependable pulse, begin to behave with a new, erratic violence. The water does not merely rise and fall, it is being pulled toward the approaching mass with a hunger that defies the ancient boundaries of the shore. People standing on coastlines watch as the horizon seems to bulge, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans straining against the crust of the Earth, reaching out toward the lunar visitor that is now closer than it has been in millions of years. This 67-hour countdown is a bridge between two states of being. On one side lies the history of a species that looked to the stars for guidance, for navigation, and for poetry. On the other side lies the cold, mathematical indifference of a kinetic event that will leave no one behind to remember it. The moon is no longer a guardian. It has become a physical manifestation of destiny, a mountain of rock the size of a continent that is falling through the vacuum with increasing fury. Every second that passes, the lunar mass gains momentum, converting its potential energy into a terrifying kinetic force. The silver disk is expanding, filling the peripheral vision of the world, turning the night sky into a wall of grey stone. As the second night begins, the moon does not set. Its orbital period has shortened so drastically that it seems to chase the sun across the heavens, appearing and reappearing with a frequency that shatters the concept of a 24-hour day. The familiar constellations are blotted out by the sheer scale of the lunar surface. It is a silent, expanding titan, a pale predator closing in on its prey. The air itself feels heavy, charged with the tension of a world being squeezed by a gravity that is no longer one-sided. The Earth too is reacting. Deep beneath the crust, The mantle groans under the shifting tidal stresses. The very ground beneath the feet of the billions watching the sky begins to vibrate, a low-frequency hum that signals the beginning of the end. There is a profound, horrific beauty in this terminal descent. To see the moon this close is to see the true scale of the cosmos. The craters are no longer mere shadows, they are vast, yawning pits of darkness, large enough to swallow entire cities. The mountain ranges of the moon, some rising kilometers into the void, are now visible as jagged teeth against the curve of the lunar horizon. The sky is no longer blue or black. It is becoming a canvas for the moon's reflection, a bruised silver that illuminates the world with a clarity that feels intrusive. The 67 hours are a gift of perspective, a final opportunity for the mind of the cosmos, humanity, to observe the mechanics of its own undoing. The transition is nearly complete. The Guardian has returned home, not to protect, but to reclaim the matter from which it was born, turning the cradle of life into a furnace of celestial debris. The foundation of this catastrophe was laid 4.5 billion years ago, in the wake of a collision so violent it liquefied the young Earth and birthed the moon from a ring of incandescent debris. For the vast majority of geological time, the relationship between these two worlds was defined by a slow, steady retreat. In the late 19th century, George Darwin, the son of the great naturalist Charles Darwin, became one of the first to apply the rigours of mathematics to this celestial dance. He recognised that the moon was not a static fixture but a dynamic partner, one that was gradually stealing the Earth's rotational energy to fuel its own escape. Through the mechanism of tidal friction, the moon has been inching away from us at a rate of approximately 3.8 centimetres every year. This slow recession acted as a cosmic stabiliser, anchoring the Earth's axial tilt and providing the rhythmic pulse of the tides that allowed life to transition from the shallows of the sea to the complexity of the continents. But as the 67-hour countdown begins, this 4 billion year trajectory of departure is violently inverted. The kinetic tension that has held the system in a delicate, precarious balance for eons suddenly snaps. In the classical model of orbital mechanics, a satellite's distance and its velocity are inextricably linked. To move closer is to move faster. As the moon begins its inward spiral, it is no longer merely a passenger of gravity, but a falling weight in a grand planetary scale clock. The energy that was once used to push the moon away is now being reclaimed with interest. Every kilometre the moon loses in altitude is converted into raw, terrifying velocity. The orbital period, which for all of recorded history has spanned 27.3 days, begins to collapse. What was once a monthly cycle is compressed into days, then hours, as the moon races to keep pace with the tightening grip of the Earth's gravitational well. This reversal signals the absolute conclusion of the world's biological era. Life on Earth is a product of stability, of a sun that shines with predictable intensity, and a moon that keeps the planet's wobble in check. As the moon descends, it disrupts the very climate it once protected. The gravitational pull on the Earth's atmosphere begins to distort the weather patterns that have remained largely unchanged since the end of the last ice age. The jet streams, those high-altitude rivers of air that dictate the movement of storms and the distribution of heat, are yanked out of their paths. The atmosphere itself begins to bulge, following the moon's path, creating localized vacuums and regions of extreme high pressure that generate winds of a magnitude never before recorded by human instruments. The kinetic energy involved in this descent is almost beyond the capacity of language to describe. As the moon moves inward, it enters the denser regions of the Earth's extended gravity field, and the tension within the lunar body itself reaches a breaking point. George Darwin's work on the tides of viscous spheres predicted that a body subjected to such immense external force would not remain a perfect circle. Instead, the moon becomes a victim of its own momentum. The side of the moon facing the Earth is subjected to a gravitational pull significantly stronger than the side facing the void. This gradient creates a physical stretching, a tug-of-war between the front and the back of the lunar mass. The moon is no longer a solid, indifferent rock. It is becoming a strained, elastic object, its internal structure groaning under the weight of its own acceleration. This is the beginning of the terminal spiral, a frantic race through the vacuum that drags the lunar mass through the outer reaches of the Earth's influence. The Moon is now a kinetic projectile of planetary proportions. In the ancient past, the Earth spun much faster, and the Moon was much closer, but the two reached a truce that allowed for the rise of forests, oceans, and civilizations. That truce is now over. The orbital decay is a feedback loop from which there is no escape. As the Moon gets closer, the tidal forces grow stronger, which in turn drags the Moon even closer. It is a mathematical inevitability that has shifted from a slow, poetic drift to a violent, accelerating plunge. The biological world, built upon the assumption of a distant and reliable Moon, cannot survive this transition. The oceans, which once provided the cradle for the first cells, are now being hoisted into the air by the proximity of the lunar mass. The very chemistry of the sea is changing as deep-seated nutrients and sediments are churned by tides that no longer respect the boundaries of the continental shelves. On land, the migration patterns of birds, the reproductive cycles of coral, and the flowering of plants, all of which were tuned to the lunar calendar, are thrown into a state of terminal confusion. The Moon, once the bringer of light in the darkness, is now the harbinger of a total ecological collapse. As the second day of the descent unfolds, the Moon's presence in the sky becomes a physical weight. The kinetic energy stored in its mass is a debt that must be paid in heat and destruction. The world is watching the reversal of history, the undoing of 4.5 billion years of celestial evolution in the span of less than 3 days. The Moon is reclaiming its heritage as a part of the Earth, and in doing so it is erasing the conditions that allowed for the existence of the very eyes that now watch it fall. The ancient recession has ended, and the frantic inward spiral has begun, turning the sky into a theatre of the end. Within the first 24 hours, the distance that once defined the safety of the Earth-Moon system, 384,000 kilometers, begins to evaporate with a predatory speed. The silver disk, which for eons occupied a mere half a degree of the celestial arc, swells until it dominates the thoughts and the vision of every living thing. By the 8th hour of the descent, the Moon has tripled in size. It is no longer a light in the sky, it is a geography. The vague, shadowy patterns of the lunar Maria, once interpreted as faces or myths, resolve into the stark, brutal reality of basaltic plains. The naked eye, unassisted by glass or lens, begins to discern the jagged anatomy of a dead world. The Copernicus crater, a scar over 90 kilometers wide, appears as a gaping rayed wound on the lunar face, its central peaks visible as tiny, sharp needles of light catching the sun. As the 12th hour passes, the Moon's expansion becomes a source of physical vertigo. The horizon is no longer a boundary between the Earth and the void, but a curve that is increasingly occluded by the approaching Titan. The Apennine Mountains, rising more than 5,000 meters from the lunar plains, are now visible not as a blur, but as a formidable range of obsidian shadows and sun-bleached peaks. One can see the individual ridges and the deep, lightless valleys of the Mare Imbrium. The Moon is reclaiming the sky, and in doing so it begins to manipulate the very light that sustains the Earth. Because the lunar orbit is decaying and its velocity is increasing according to the laws of conservation of angular momentum, the Moon begins to overtake the Sun in the sky with a frequency that shatters the concept of a solar day. The world enters a state of flickering twilight. Total solar eclipses, once rare and sacred events that occurred once in a lifetime for any single point on the globe, now happen every few hours. The Sun is repeatedly blotted out by the massive grey wall of the Moon. Each time the Moon passes before the solar disk, a colossal shadow, the umbra, sweeps across the continents at thousands of kilometers per hour. To an observer on the ground, the Sun does not set. It is extinguished. The temperature drops 20 degrees in a matter of minutes, and the birds fall silent, confused by a night that arrives without warning. When the Sun re-emerges from behind the lunar limb, it does so with a strange, distorted brilliance. its rays catching the jagged edges of lunar mountains to create a diamond ring effect that lasts for minutes rather than seconds. The light that remains on Earth during these brief intervals of sunshine is sickly and bruised. The moon is now so close that it reflects an immense amount of solar radiation back onto the night side of the Earth. True darkness has vanished. Midnight is replaced by a harsh silver glare that is bright enough to cast sharp shadows and wash out the stars. This reflected light, known as Earthshine in reverse, illuminates the landscape with a ghostly monochromatic intensity. The shadows cast by trees, buildings, and mountains on Earth are no longer governed by the slow, predictable path of the sun. Instead, they warp and stretch in erratic directions, dictated by the moon's frantic transit. These shadows are long and irregular, crawling across the ground like reaching fingers as the moon's proximity distorts the angle of every photon reaching the surface. By the 20th hour, the lunar surface occupies nearly 30% of the overhead sky. The sense of scale is overwhelming. The moon is no longer up there, it is right here. The mountains of the moon, such as the Lunar Alps and the Caucasus Range, are so clearly defined that they appear as a ceiling of stone hanging over the atmosphere. The craters are no longer circles, they are vast, yawning pits of darkness, deep enough to house entire terrestrial mountain ranges. The Tycho crater, with its brilliant system of rays, looks like a frozen explosion, its white dust trails spanning thousands of kilometers across the lunar disk. The texture of the moon, the fine powdery regolith and the ancient frozen lava flows, is visible in such detail that the world feels as though it is being pulled into a microscopic view of a pebble, only the pebble is the size of a continent. The atmosphere of the Earth begins to react to this encroaching mass. The air itself feels thinner, as if it is being teased upward by the moon's gravity. The sky, during the brief moments it is not occupied by the moon or the sun, takes on a deep electric blue hue, the result of unusual scattering patterns caused by the lunar proximity. The psychological impact of this visual expansion is a form of collective paralysis. The moon has transitioned from a symbol of the night to a physical threat that blocks out the stars, the sun, and the very concept of a future. As the first 24 hours conclude, the Earth is no longer a planet with a moon. It is a world trapped in the gravitational embrace of a falling mountain, watching as the grey, cratered skin of its killer becomes the only horizon that matters. The 67-hour clock continues to tick, and the moon continues to grow, a silent, expanding titan that has only just begun its final approach. The descent is governed by a mathematical boundary that has remained invisible for eons, a phantom line in the void first identified in the year 1848 by the French astronomer Edouard Roche. While the world watches the moon grow in the sky, the underlying physics of the catastrophe are dictated by the threshold he calculated, a point where the structural integrity of a satellite is sacrificed to the tidal hunger of its primary planet. Roche's legacy is the discovery of the limit that bears his name, a distance defined by the precarious balance between two opposing forces, the self-gravity that holds a moon together and the tidal forces that seek to tear it apart. For the Earth and its lunar companion, this invisible line of demarcation sits at approximately 18,470 kilometers from the center of our world. Gravity is not a uniform cloak, but a gradient that grows more intense with proximity. As the moon draws closer, the Earth's gravitational pull on the near side of the lunar body becomes significantly more powerful than the pull on the far side. This discrepancy creates a stretching force, a tidal tension, that acts like a pair of invisible hands grasping the moon and pulling in opposite directions. For billions of years, the moon's own self-gravity, the internal force generated by its mass that keeps its rocks and dust pinned into a spherical shape, was more than enough to resist this stretching. But as the terminal descent continues and the distance between the two worlds evaporates, the tidal force increases according to the inverse cube of the distance, while the moon's self-gravity remains constant. The physics of this encounter are brutal and indifferent. When a satellite crosses the Roche limit, it enters a zone where the planet's tidal influence exceeds the satellite's ability to hold itself together. It is the point of no return, not for the trajectory of the fall, but for the very existence of the Moon as a solid object. At 18,470 kilometers, the Moon ceases to be a world and becomes a collection of unanchored debris. The math dictates that any celestial body composed of rock and ice, held together by nothing but its own weight, will find its internal cohesion overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the primary's gravitational field. It is a threshold where the geometry of space-time turns a moon into a ring. Edouard Roche arrived at this conclusion by studying the rings of Saturn, recognizing them not as a failed moon that never formed, but as the shattered remains of a moon that wandered too close to the gas giant. He understood that the cosmos is littered with these invisible traps, where the tidal forces of massive bodies act as a celestial thresher. As the 67-hour countdown progresses, the Moon is rapidly approaching this 18,470-kilometer mark. It is currently a rigid body of silicate and basalt, but the closer it gets to the limit, the more it begins to behave like a fluid. The internal stresses are so immense that the solid rock of the lunar mantle begins to flow and deform under the pressure, reaching a state of plastic failure long before the first piece of crust actually breaks away. The tragedy of the Roche limit is that it represents a death by 1,000 cuts. It is not a sudden collision with a solid surface, but a systematic dismantling of a world by the invisible fingers of gravity. The Moon is being weighed on a mathematical scale, and the result is already known. The 18,470-kilometer line is the edge of a gravitational abyss. Once the lunar center of mass crosses that threshold, the tidal forces will become so dominant that they will literally lift the mountains off the lunar surface and pull the core out through the crust. The self-gravity that has maintained the Moon's shape since the dawn of the solar system will be rendered irrelevant, a minor variable swallowed by the overwhelming power of the Earth's proximity. This scientific reality adds a layer of cold, calculated terror to the visual spectacle in the sky. Every kilometre the Moon loses brings it closer to its own structural dissolution. The observer on the ground sees a massive looming orb, but the physicist sees a body under extreme mechanical stress, a sphere being stretched into an ellipsoid, its very atoms straining against the tidal gradient. The Earth too feels the strain. As the Moon approaches the Roche limit, it exerts an equal and opposite tidal force on our planet, dragging the crust and the oceans upward with a ferocity that defies the history of the world. The 18,470-kilometer line is the final gate, the moment when the story of the Moon as a singular entity ends and the story of the Earth's rings begins. The 67 hours are a race toward this mathematical certainty. There is no force in the known universe that can reinforce the Moon's self-gravity once it enters the Roche zone. The laws of physics, which once provided the stability for life to flourish, are now the very mechanisms of its erasure. The Moon is a falling titan, and Roche's limit is the guillotine. As the distance closes to within 20,000 kilometers, the tension in the lunar interior reaches its peak. The Moon is no longer just a light or a geography. It is a pressurized vessel of rock about to burst, a celestial body on the verge of becoming a cloud of fire and stone. The invisible line is almost reached, and the transition from order to fragmentation is only hours away. As the countdown reaches the 33-hour mark, the halfway point of this terminal descent, the celestial geometry shifts from the elegant to the monstrous. The circular silhouette that has defined the night for billions of years is gone, replaced by a sight that defies the ancient human intuition of what a world should be. The Moon is no longer a sphere. Under the relentless and increasing pressure of the Earth's gravitational gradient, the lunar body has been forced into the shape of a prolate spheroid, a jagged, stony egg, its long axis pointed directly at the heart of our planet. This deformation is not a subtle shift of a few meters. It is a fundamental restructuring of a planetary mass, a physical manifestation of the tidal forces that are now the primary architects of the lunar landscape. The cause of this distortion lies in the widening disparity between the gravitational pull on the near and far sides of the Moon. At a distance now well under 100,000 kilometers, the side of the Moon facing the Earth is significantly closer to our planet's center of mass than the side facing the void. This difference in distance creates a tidal gradient so powerful that the moon's own self-gravity is becoming a secondary force. The Earth is reaching out and physically hauling the lunar crust toward itself, while the far side of the moon, experiencing a slightly weaker pull, lags behind. The result is a world caught on a gravitational rack, being stretched and elongated until its very crust begins to fail. Deep within the lunar interior, the stresses are cataclysmic. For eons, the moon has been a geologically quiet world, its mantle cold and its core largely dormant. Now, that internal stillness is shattered. The tidal forces are kneading the lunar mantle like dough, forcing billions of trillions of tons of silicate rock to rub against one another. This internal friction generates an immense amount of heat, a process known as tidal heating. The moon is beginning to warm from the inside out, its temperature rising not from the light of the sun, but from the mechanical energy of its own deformation. Deep moonquakes, far more powerful than any recorded during the Apollo missions, ripple through the lithosphere. These are not the tremors of a cooling world, but the screams of a world being torn apart. The lunar mantle, once rigid, begins to behave with a terrifying plasticity. Under the extreme pressure, the rock begins to flow, moving like thick glass or cooling wax toward the Earth-facing bulge. On the surface, the visual evidence of this internal struggle is undeniable. The familiar geography of the moon is warping. The great basaltic plains of the Maria are stretching, their once circular borders becoming elongated ovals. Craters that have stood for 3 billion years are being sheared in half as the crust beneath them fractures. Long obsidian fissures, rills of a scale never before seen, tear across the lunar face, venting ancient gases trapped beneath the surface for eons. The moon is no longer a dead rock, it is a living, groaning entity, its surface a web of glowing heat and shifting stone. From the perspective of the Earth, the moon now occupies a staggering portion of the sky. It is a pale, misshapen titan that seems to hang just beyond the reach of the clouds. The egg-like shape is clearly visible to the naked eye, a distorted omen that signals the end of the celestial status quo. The light reflected from this distorted surface is uneven and flickering, as the dust kicked up by the relentless moonquakes begins to form a thin, temporary atmosphere of pulverized regolith. This shroud of dust catches the sunlight, creating a hazy golden aura around the elongated lunar limb, making the moon appear even more ethereal and threatening. The Earth is not a passive observer in this process. Just as the moon is being stretched into a prolate spheroid, the Earth's own crust is reacting to the proximity of the lunar mass. The ground beneath the continents is being pulled upward by several meters, creating a terrestrial bulge that mirrors the lunar one. This is not the movement of water, but the movement of the solid Earth. Mountain ranges are being compressed, and tectonic plates that have remained locked for centuries are beginning to grind against one another. The very foundation of our world is rising to meet its killer, a mutual attraction that is as beautiful as it is lethal. The groaning of the lunar mantle can be felt on Earth as a low-frequency vibration, a hum that resonates through the crust and into the very bones of those watching the sky. It is the sound of a planetary-scale structural failure. The moon is being pulled so hard that its internal cohesion is reaching its limit. Every hour that passes, the elongation becomes more pronounced, the egg shape more extreme. The moon is reaching the point where it can no longer be described as a solid body. It is becoming a collection of loosely bound layers, held together by a self-gravity that is failing in the face of the Earth's overwhelming tidal hunger. The 33-hour mark is the threshold of the final collapse, the moment when the moon ceases to be a world and begins to transition into the debris that will soon define the sky. The silver guardian is gone, and in its place is a misshapen, groaning titan, falling toward the Roche limit with a speed that turns the remaining hours into a frantic final countdown. The hydrosphere is the first to surrender to the mounting gravitational pressure. On an ordinary day, the moon's influence on the oceans is a gentle tug, a rhythmic rise and fall that defines the boundaries of the shore. But as the distance between the worlds shrinks to less than 50,000 kilometers, the concept of a tide is replaced by a permanent, catastrophic displacement of the sea. The oceans are no longer bound by the basins of the Earth, they are being hoisted into the air. A mountain of water, kilometres high and hundreds of kilometres wide, forms directly beneath the moon's position in the sky. This is not a wave that breaks and recedes, but a static, towering bulge that follows the lunar path with the relentless precision of a shadow. As this tidal bulge sweeps across the planet, it ignores the ancient borders of the continents. New York, London and Tokyo do not merely flood, they are erased. The water does not rise with the violence of a storm surge, but with the terrifying, silent inevitability of a rising floor. Skyscrapers that once touched the clouds are swallowed by a sea that has been lifted toward the stars. The weight of this displaced water is so immense that it begins to depress the oceanic crust, further complicating the geological chaos. The coastlines of the world are gone, replaced by a global churning abyss where the salt water of the deep and the fresh water of the rivers mingle in a chaotic, silt-choked slurry. Yet, the liquid oceans are only the most visible victims. Beneath the waves and the sediment, the solid Earth itself is beginning to fail. The lithosphere, the thin, brittle skin of our planet, is being pulled upward by the proximity of the lunar mass. In a phenomenon known as a body tide, the ground rises by 5, 10, and then 15 meters to meet the descending moon. This is not a metaphor. The very bedrock beneath the feet of those inland is surging upward. This massive displacement of the crust creates a state of terminal tectonic unrest. The plates that form the mosaic of the Earth's surface, usually moving at the speed of a growing fingernail, are suddenly subjected to stresses that exceed their structural limits. The Ring of Fire, that volatile belt of volcanic and seismic activity encircling the Pacific, ignites with a ferocity that dwarfs any event in recorded history. The San Andreas Fault, the Mariana Trench, and the jagged peaks of the Himalayas become the epicenters of a global shattering. Earthquakes of magnitude 10 and 11, shocks so powerful they cannot be measured by traditional scales, ripple through the continents. These are not mere tremors. They are the sounds of the Earth's foundation being ground into dust. The crust is fracturing, creating vast, yawning chasms that swallow entire forests and plains as the planet struggles to maintain its shape against the lunar pull. Deep within the Earth, the mantle is being squeezed. The pressure on the magma chambers, those subterranean reservoirs of molten rock, becomes unbearable. As the crust thins and cracks under the tidal strain, the magma finds a path to the surface. Volcanic eruptions of a scale not seen since the Siberian traps begin to vent ash and fire into the atmosphere. From the peaks of the Andes to the volcanic islands of Indonesia, the Earth is bleeding. Fountains of lava, propelled by the same gravitational force that is lifting the oceans, reach kilometers into the sky. The air is filled with a thick, suffocating shroud of sulfuric ash and steam, turning the sky from a bruised silver into a lightless, suffocating black. The planet is undergoing a process of total structural reorganization. The Earth is no longer a stable home. It has become a reactive, deforming body, its geography being rewritten in real time by the falling moon. The relationship between the two worlds is now a lethal embrace, a mutual deformation where the Earth rises to meet its killer. The energy being released by these tectonic and volcanic events is staggering, contributing to a global rise in temperature that parallels the tidal heating occurring within the moon itself. The very atmosphere is being churned by the rising crust and the falling water, creating a chaotic environment where the wind, the sea, and the stone are all in a state of violent, unpredictable motion. In these final hours, the Earth is a world in transition. The biological era is being buried under kilometers of water and layers of volcanic ash. The stability that allowed for the rise of civilizations, the firm ground, the predictable seas, has been revealed as a fragile illusion, a temporary peace negotiated by a distance that no longer exists. The moon is now so close that its gravity is the primary architect of the terrestrial landscape. The Earth is no longer just a planet. It is a victim of its own companion, its crust buckling and its oceans rising as it prepares for the final, kinetic resolution of the 67-hour countdown. The stage is set for the crossing of the Roche limit, where the liquid and solid chaos of the Earth will meet the shattered remains of the lunar world. The final 10 hours begin with a fundamental shift in the geometry of the heavens. According to the dictates of Kepler's third law, the relationship between distance and time has reached a state of runaway acceleration. Because the square of the orbital period is proportional to the cube of the distance from the centre of the Earth, the Moon is no longer a leisurely traveller completing a circuit in 27 days. It is now a frantic kinetic projectile, completing an entire orbit in a matter of hours. The sky has become a blur of motion. The sun rises and sets with a dizzying frequency, but even its light is constantly interrupted by the massive grey silhouette of the Moon, which now screams across the horizon like a stone skipped across the surface of a pond. The Moon has descended into the exosphere, the outermost fringe of the Earth's atmosphere where the air is so thin that individual molecules can travel hundreds of kilometres without colliding. Yet, even in this rarefied void, the sheer mass and velocity of the lunar body begin to make their presence felt. The Moon is now moving at several kilometres every single second. It drags a wake of ionised gas behind it, a ghostly tail of blue and violet light that stretches across the stars. This is the first physical contact between the two worlds, not of rock, but of gas and energy. The upper atmosphere is being compressed by the leading edge of the lunar bulge, creating a shock wave of heat that radiates downward through the thermosphere. To an observer on the ground, the Moon is no longer a celestial body, it is the sky. It occupies more than 60% of the overhead arc, a wall of cratered basalt that seems to hover just above the mountains. The curvature of the Moon is so vast that the human eye can no longer perceive it as a sphere. Instead, it appears as a moving ceiling of stone, a world in motion that is so close one can see the interplay of light and shadow within the deep rills and valleys of the lunar highlands. The speed of its transit is terrifying. It does not crawl across the stars, it lunges. One moment the horizon is clear, and the next a mountain range the size of the Himalayas, the lunar Apennines, sweeps overhead, blotting out the sun and plunging the world into a frigid, unnatural darkness. The atmosphere itself is thinning, not because it is being lost to space, but because it is being pulled upward by the Moon's immense gravitational well. The air at the surface becomes noticeably less dense as the Moon passes directly overhead, the molecules being teased toward the lunar surface. This creates a rhythmic planetary-scale pulse of pressure. Each time the Moon races by, the barometric pressure drops, and the winds howl toward the point of lowest pressure directly beneath the lunar mass. These are not weather patterns born of heat and moisture, but of pure gravitational displacement. The wind is being dragged along by the Moon, creating global-scale vortices that reach from the surface into the very edge of space. The visual spectacle is one of total, overwhelming scale. The Moon is now so close that the features of the lunar surface are no longer distant abstractions. The vast plains of the Mare Tranquillitatis are visible as dark, dusty expanses, while the bright rays of the Tycho crater look like frozen rivers of white glass. The light reflected from the Moon is so intense that it creates a permanent silver day, even when the sun is on the other side of the planet. The shadows cast by the mountains on Earth are long and frantic, dancing in response to the Moon's rapid transit. The world is bathed in a harsh, monochromatic glare that reveals every detail of the crumbling terrestrial landscape, the rising oceans, the fractured crust, and the smoke of 1,000 volcanoes. As the final 5 hours approach, the Moon begins to dip into the thermosphere, the layer of the atmosphere where temperatures can reach 1,500 degrees Celsius. The friction, though still minor compared to what is to come, begins to char the lunar regolith. A faint, incandescent glow starts to flicker along the leading edge of the Moon, a precursor to the firestorm that will soon consume the sky. The Moon is no longer falling, it is arriving. The 18,470-kilometre line is now a tangible looming presence, a mathematical guillotine that the Moon is about to strike. The orbital period has shortened to the point where the Moon is almost always visible, a constant moving ceiling of stone that serves as a reminder that the time for observation is nearly at an end. The kinetic energy of the system is reaching its peak, a debt of 4 billion years that is about to be settled in a single, catastrophic moment of structural failure. The horizon is gone. There is only the Earth below and the Moon above, two worlds separated by a distance that is now less than the diameter of the Earth itself. The sky is a graveyard of light, and the Moon is the tombstone, racing toward the Roche limit with a velocity that turns the final hours into a blur of grey stone and ionized fire. The countdown has reached its final phase, where the laws of orbital mechanics give way to the laws of fragmentation and heat. The Moon arrives at the invisible threshold of 18,470 kilometers, and the fundamental architecture of the lunar world simply ceases to function. This is the moment of disruption, a term in celestial mechanics that belies the sheer, earth-shattering scale of the event. For billions of years, the Moon has been held together by its own self-gravity, a force that pinned every grain of dust and every mountain range to its centre. But at this precise distance from the Earth's core, the tidal gradient, the difference in the Earth's pull between the near side and the far side of the Moon, finally exceeds that internal bond. The centre cannot hold. The Moon is no longer a world. It is a collection of unanchored matter, a trillion-ton corpse being eviscerated by the invisible fingers of gravity. The structural failure begins not on the surface, but deep within the lunar interior. The core, once a solid and silent heart of iron and sulfur, is pulled toward the Earth with a ferocity that the rest of the lunar mass cannot match. This internal decoupling causes the Moon to undergo a total mechanical breakdown. The mantle, already softened by the intense tidal heating of the previous 60 hours, begins to flow like liquid glass, but it has nowhere to go. The internal pressure reaches a point of catastrophic release. Long, jagged fissures, some hundreds of kilometers deep, tear through the lunar crust, venting the last remnants of the Moon's ancient trapped gases into the void. This is the sound of a world breaking, a low-frequency vibration that resonates through the very fabric of space-time and into the terrestrial crust below. As the Moon crosses the 18,470 kilometer mark, the crust itself begins to shatter. It does not crumble like a dry cookie. It disintegrates like a mountain range subjected to 1,000 simultaneous earthquakes. The lunar Apennines, the Caucasus Mountains, and the jagged rims of craters like Tycho and Copernicus are lifted off the surface. These are not mere rocks. They are shards of basalt and anorthosite the size of cities, some the size of small European nations. They hover for a fraction of a second, suspended between the failing gravity of their parent and the overwhelming hunger of the Earth before they are swept into the terminal spiral. The Moon is being unravelled, its skin being peeled away in layers of stone and dust. The process of disruption turns the lunar surface into a swirling, chaotic vortex of debris. Billions of tons of regolith, the fine grey dust that has sat undisturbed since the dawn of the solar system, are whipped into a colossal cloud that begins to stretch along the orbital path. This dust acts as a kinetic abrasive, sandblasting the larger shards of the lunar crust as they break away. The Moon is losing its shape entirely, transitioning from a prolate spheroid into a disorganized, elongated stream of matter. From the Earth, the sight is one of absolute cosmic horror. The grey wall of the sky is breaking apart. The solid ceiling of the world is dissolving into 1,000 falling mountains, each one glowing with the heat of its own internal friction and the beginning of atmospheric contact. This fragmentation is not a sudden explosion, but a systematic dismantling. The tidal forces act like a giant invisible thresher, separating the Moon into its constituent parts based on their density and distance. The near side of the Moon is pulled faster and harder, accelerating toward the Earth's thermosphere, while the far side lags, creating a bridge of broken stone that spans thousands of kilometers of space. This is the birth of the ring system, but it is a birth born of total destruction. There is no longer a moon to look at. There is only a river of shattered geology, a white-hot torrent of silicate rock that occupies the entire overhead view. The kinetic energy released during this fragmentation is staggering. As the moon's self-gravity fails, the potential energy that was stored in its structural integrity is converted into heat and motion. The shards of the moon rub against one another with such force that they begin to glow with a dull red light. The sky is no longer grey. It is becoming a mosaic of fire and shadow. Each mountain-sized fragment carries the momentum of an orbital projectile, and as they collide within the widening stream of debris, they break down further into smaller and smaller pieces, creating a cascading effect of destruction. The Earth's atmosphere, now thin and distended, begins to receive the first of these lunar ambassadors. The very smallest particles of dust and sand-sized grains of regolith hit the upper layers of the air at speeds exceeding 10 kilometers per second. They do not just fall, they ignite. The sky is filled with billions of shooting stars, a meteor shower of such intensity that it turns the heavens into a solid sheet of incandescent light. But these are merely the scouts. Behind them come the mountains, the jagged obsidian teeth of a dead world, falling toward a planet that has no way to defend itself. The Roche limit has been breached, the moon has been shattered, and the final incandescent act of the 67-hour drama is about to begin. The transition from a singular celestial body to a disorganized cloud of fire is complete, and the Earth is now the sole target of a broken moon's remains. The silver sphere is no more. In its place, a torrent of incandescent matter begins to wrap itself around the equator of the Earth, a process of redistribution that turns a world into a ring. This is the Great Shredding, where the lunar volume is flattened into a disk of white-hot silicate. As the trillions of tons of lunar rock cross the threshold of the Roche limit, they are subjected to a celestial millstone. The Earth's gravity does not just pull, it grinds. The fragments of the lunar crust, already shattered into mountain-sized shards, collide with one another at velocities of several kilometers per second. These collisions are so energetic that the kinetic force is instantly converted into thermal energy, causing the once cold stone of the moon to glow with a blinding, hellish intensity. The sky is being rewritten in fire. This temporary ring system, born from the corpse of a moon, is composed of billions of jagged fragments ranging from the size of grains of sand to the scale of the Alps. Unlike the icy, serene rings of Saturn, which reflect the distant light of the sun, this ring is self-luminous. It is a halo of molten rock, a spinning carousel of fire that illuminates the Earth with a terrifying, shadowless brilliance. The silicate vapour, boiled off the surfaces of the colliding fragments, creates a luminous haze that fills the gaps between the larger rocks, making the ring appear as a solid, unbroken band of light. It spans the entire circumference of the planet, a golden crown of destruction that signifies the final hours of the terrestrial era. The beauty of this event is a cruel mathematical perfection. The conservation of angular momentum dictates that the debris cannot simply fall straight down, it must orbit. As the moon fragments, its mass spreads out along its orbital path, forming a bridge of fire that eventually connects its own head to its tail. Within hours, the Earth is encircled. From the surface, looking up is like staring into the heart of a furnace. The ring is not a static object, but a rushing river of stone, moving so fast that it appears as a blurred streak of light across the zenith. The friction within this disk is immense. The larger fragments are constantly being ground down by a hail of smaller particles, a process of mutual erosion that fills the orbital plane with a thick glowing fog of pulverized basalt. The Earth is now a world within a halo. The ring casts a colossal shadow across the hemispheres, not facing the sun, but this shadow is not dark. It is filled with the reflected glow of the molten silicate, turning the night into a deep, blood-red twilight. The atmosphere, distended and reaching upward, begins to brush against the innermost edge of the ring. This contact is a friction of a different kind. The air acts as a brake, dragging on the orbiting debris and causing the lowest fragments to lose their velocity. These pieces begin to spiral out of the ring and into the upper thermosphere, creating a continuous global rain of fire. They are the first drops of a kinetic deluge that will soon scour the planet clean. This redistribution of mass is a violent correction in the ledger of the solar system. The Moon, which was once a separate entity with its own history and its own gravity, is being integrated into the Earth's immediate environment. It is no longer a companion but a part of the planet's own structure. The ring is a temporary state, a transitional form between a moon and a layer of impact melt. It is a spinning disk of fire that represents the total energy of the lunar descent, a kinetic monument to the power of gravity. The terrifying beauty of the halo is the last thing the Earth will ever see. The sky is a wall of incandescent stone, and the world is trapped in the centre of a celestial furnace, watching as the remains of its guardian are turned into the instruments of its extinction. As the ring stabilises, the internal collisions begin to subside, but the heat remains. The silicate rock, heated to thousands of degrees, radiates a thermal energy that begins to bake the Earth from above. This is not the gentle warmth of the sun, but a direct infrared assault that bypasses the cooling mechanisms of the atmosphere. The oceans, already displaced by the tidal bulge, begin to simmer. The clouds are burned away, leaving the surface exposed to the full, unshielded glare of the molten ring. The world is a stage of fire, and the ring is the curtain, closing on the story of life with a brilliance that turns the very air into a weapon. The shredding is complete, the halo is formed, and the final descent of the fragments into the heart of the world is all that remains. The innermost edge of the newly formed ring system begins to fray as the first wave of lunar debris spirals down into the upper reaches of the thermosphere. This is the beginning of the atmospheric interaction, a phase of the catastrophe where the air itself is transformed into a weapon of total sterilization. As the shards of the moon, some the size of pebbles, others the size of whole mountain ranges, strike the thinning gases of the outer atmosphere, they are travelling at velocities exceeding 10 kilometers per second. At these speeds, the air cannot simply flow around the falling masses. Instead, it is caught in a state of violent instantaneous compression. This is the process of adiabatic heating, a physical phenomenon where the temperature of a gas rises not because of an external flame, but because the gas is being crushed with such force that its internal energy is concentrated into a tiny hyperactive volume. The sky, once a familiar blue or a bruised silver, now undergoes a transition into a blinding incandescent white. This is the light of the atmosphere being turned into plasma. The shock waves preceding the falling debris compress the nitrogen and oxygen molecules so severely that they are ripped apart into a glowing fluid of ions and electrons. The temperature of the overhead sky rapidly climbs past 1,000, then 3,000, and finally exceeds 5,000 degrees Celsius. This is a heat comparable to the surface of the sun itself, suspended only a few dozen kilometers above the surface of the Earth. The atmosphere is no longer a protective blanket. It has become a global furnace, a radiant ceiling of fire that begins to bake the world below with a lethal infrared intensity. The effect on the terrestrial surface is instantaneous and absolute. This is the sterilization phase, a moment where the heat radiation from the sky arrives long before the first physical impact of the lunar rock. Across the continents, forests do not catch fire in the traditional sense. They spontaneously flash into ash. The moisture within the leaves and the wood is converted into steam so quickly that the trees explode from within. The grasslands and the remaining structures of human civilization are ignited by the mere sight of the sky. This is a world where the horizon is a wall of white-hot gas, and the very air is thick with the scent of ozone and vaporized minerals. The oceans, already displaced and churning from the tidal forces of the previous days, now begin to boil from the top down. The surface layers of the Atlantic and Pacific are converted into a global shroud of steam that rises to meet the descending fire. This steam layer creates a momentary barrier, a cushion of vapor that attempts to insulate the depths, but the sheer magnitude of the thermal energy coming from the incandescent sky is too great. The heat penetrates the water, killing everything in the shallows and turning the once teeming seas into a sterile, bubbling cauldron. The chemistry of the atmosphere is permanently altered as the intense heat triggers the formation of nitrogen oxides and other caustic compounds, turning the very air into a corrosive glowing mist. The visual spectacle is one of terrifying, shadowless clarity. There are no longer any shadows on Earth because the entire sky is a source of light. Every crevice of every mountain, every valley and every street is illuminated by the 5,000-degree glare of the thermosphere. The clouds have been vaporized, leaving nothing between the surface and the incandescent plasma of the sky. One can see the individual shards of the moon as they descend through this wall of fire, their leading edges glowing with a brilliance that exceeds the sun. They're no longer just rocks, they are kinetic hammers, their surfaces melting and trailing long plumes of vaporized silicate as they prepare to strike the final blow. This is the ultimate expression of the kinetic energy that has been building since the moon first began its terminal descent 67 hours ago. The potential energy of a world-sized mass has been converted into the thermal energy of a planetary-scale furnace. The atmosphere, which for millions of years served as the cradle for the biosphere, is now the instrument of its erasure. The air is a glowing white-hot fluid that scours the surface of the planet, removing every trace of organic life and preparing the ground for the physical redistribution of mass that is to follow. The world is being prepared for the end, not by the impact of a single stone, but by the weight of a sky that has forgotten how to be cold. The transition from a living world to a sterilized molten sphere is nearly complete, as the first of the mountain-sized fragments finally pierce the lower atmosphere and prepare to make contact with the fractured crust of the Earth. The kinetic toll of this final convergence is a value that exists on a scale far beyond the reach of human experience, yet it is the only metric that remains in a world without observers. The total energy released as the lunar mass is reintegrated into the terrestrial sphere is approximately 1 × 10⁻30 joules. This number represents the absolute resolution of a 4 billion-year orbital debt. It is the sum of every kilogram of lunar basalt accelerated through the Earth's gravitational well, now suddenly and violently converted into heat, light and sound. This energy is not a single flash, but a sustained global pulverization that turns the very concept of a planet into a chaotic laboratory of high-energy physics. As the first of the mountain-sized fragments strike the surface, they do not merely impact the ground, they sunder it. Travelling at 10 kilometers per second, these shards of the moon possess a kinetic energy that exceeds the chemical bonds holding the Earth's crust together. Upon impact, the rock does not shatter, it behaves like a fluid. A shockwave of pressure, measuring in the millions of atmospheres, radiates outward from each point of contact, vaporizing the terrestrial bedrock and the lunar projectile alike. The crust is peeled back in colossal glowing petals of molten stone, exposing the white-hot mantle beneath. This is the redistribution of mass in its most primal form, a cold mathematical correction where the geometry of two worlds is forced into a single, new equilibrium. The oceans, which have defined the surface of this world for eons, are the next to vanish. The thermal energy of the impacts, combined with the 5,000-degree heat of the incandescent atmosphere, triggers a phase change on a planetary scale. Within minutes, the remaining liquid water of the Earth is flashed into a global shroud of steam. The Atlantic and Pacific basins are emptied, their contents hoisted into the sky as a pressurized opaque vapor. This steam shroud expands with a force that strips the remaining atmosphere of its nitrogen and oxygen, creating a world-sized pressure cooker. The Earth is no longer a blue marble. It is a featureless white sphere of superheated gas, a cauldron where the very chemical signatures of the sea are being lost to the void. Beneath this shroud, the biosphere is erased with a finality that leaves no trace of its existence. The erasure is total. This is not the slow death of a changing climate or the localized destruction of a single asteroid. It is a total molecular breakdown. The heat is so intense that the carbon-based molecules of life, the proteins, the sugars, and the complex strands of genetic information are broken into their constituent atoms. The forests, the coral reefs, and the cities of man are not just destroyed, they are transmuted into the glowing slag of a new, molten surface. The history of life, from the first self-replicating cell to the last human thought, is consumed in the furnace of the lunar return. The slate of the world is not just wiped clean, it is melted and recast. The Earth is now a world of liquid stone, a magma ocean that stretches from pole to pole. The energy of the collision has effectively reset the planetary clock, returning the Earth to the Hadean state of its infancy 4.5 billion years ago. The mountains of the Earth and the shattered remains of the Moon are ground together into a single uniform sea of silicate. The tectonic plates, which once dictated the slow, majestic dance of the continents, have been liquefied and merged. The planet is unrecognizable, a glowing orange wasteland that radiates its heat into the darkness of space with a desperate infrared intensity. This is the landscape of the end, a world without geography, without biology, and without a future. The redistribution of mass is complete. The Moon is no longer a separate entity. It has become a layer of impact melt that now coats the surface of the Earth. The energy of 1 × 10 to the power of 30 joules has been spent, leaving behind a world that is a testament to the cold indifference of the laws of physics. The 67-hour countdown has reached its conclusion, and the result is a sterile, molten sphere, a silent witness to the power of gravity to both create and destroy. The celestial machine has performed its necessary correction, and the Earth is left as a cooling cinder in the dark, a monument to a moon that came home and a world that could not survive its embrace. The silence that follows the final impact is not an empty one. It is the silence of a ledger that has finally been balanced. The universe operates on a principle of cold mathematical indifference, a machine of gravity and momentum that requires no audience and seeks no approval. It does not recognize the songs humanity sang to the silver orb in the night, nor does it acknowledge the calendars carved into ancient bone to track the phases of a moon that is now part of the Earth's crust. To the vacuum of space, the destruction of the biosphere and the melting of the world are merely a redistribution of mass, a violent but necessary correction in a clockwork mechanism that never learned how to feel. The peace that once allowed for the rise of civilization was always a fragile negotiation, a temporary gift of distance and constants that we mistook for a permanent right. Our forever was always contingent upon the stability of a few decimal points in the laws of orbital mechanics, a peace negotiated by gravity that has now reached its expiration. Yet within this catastrophic resolution, there exists a profound and solitary dignity. In those final 67 hours, humanity underwent a transformation. We were no longer merely the inhabitants of a planet, subjects to the whims of weather and season. We became the ultimate observers, the only arrangement of atoms in this entire solar system capable of understanding the geometry of our own extinction. There is a rare, terrifying beauty in the fact that a species could calculate the Roche limit, map the trajectory of its own destroyer, and comprehend the physics of the fire that would eventually consume it. To see the end is to have existed in the first place. To understand the mechanism of the collapse is to have transcended the status of a mere biological accident. We transitioned from being subjects of the planet to being the mind of the cosmos, recognizing that while the machine is eternal, the privilege of watching it work, even in its most destructive moments, is a rare, fleeting spark in the dark. We are the mind of the cosmos, the part of the universe that has developed eyes to look back at the machine and recognize how it works. While the stars remain indifferent and the laws of physics continue their blind, relentless march, we were the ones who gave the event a name. We were the ones who saw the beauty in the glowing ring of silicate and the terror in the expanding lunar face. This is the privilege of consciousness, to be a fleeting spark in the dark that, for a brief moment, holds the entire history of the universe within its gaze. The privilege of watching the clockwork work, even in its most destructive and final moments, is the highest form of existence. We are the witnesses to the grand architecture, the only ones who can say that here, for a time, there was something that understood the light. We were the only ones who could appreciate the terrible precision of the 18,470-kilometre line, seeing it not as a cause for fear, but as a masterpiece of celestial logic. The story of the Earth and its moon is a single chapter in a much larger narrative, a chronicle of matter and energy that spans billions of years and trillions of kilometres. Though the world may be a molten wasteland, and the moon a memory etched in stone, the journey of discovery does not end with a single world. The cosmos is filled with these moments of creation and correction, each one a lesson in the power of the laws that govern everything from the smallest atom to the largest galaxy. To understand where we are is to understand where we came from, and the forces that shape the destiny of every star in the sky. Even in the absence of life, the mathematics remain, the orbits continue, and the light of distant suns will eventually fall upon the cooling surface of this new, unified world. The atoms that once made up our bodies, our oceans and our moon will eventually find new forms, perhaps becoming part of a new ring, a new planet, or a new star, continuing their journey through the infinite. This narrative is a testament to the power of observation and the enduring quest for knowledge. To look into the void and see not just darkness, but the intricate workings of a magnificent machine is the hallmark of our existence. The history of the universe is written in the language of physics, but it is read by those who have the courage to look upward. Every fragment of rock and every beam of light tells a story of how we came to be and how the universe continues to evolve, indifferent to our presence but enriched by our understanding. We are the storytellers of the stars, the ones who weave the disparate threads of gravity, time, and matter into a coherent tapestry of meaning. If you found value in this exploration of the terminal descent and the physics of the end, consider joining us as we continue to map the vast, unfolding narrative of the heavens. The history of the universe is a story that belongs to all who look upward and wonder. Subscribe to the channel to become part of a community dedicated to uncovering the secrets of the deep past and the distant future. Together we will continue to witness the beauty, the terror, and the mathematical perfection of the world we inhabit. Join us for the next chapter in the history of the universe.